I definitely did feel intimidated, but I think one of the great things about business journalism is that you can always have facts at the ready. So if you've done your homework and you know the numbers and you know the questions you want to ask, then it doesn't really matter how people treat you as long as you have your questions and as long as you're getting your answers. So I think one of the essentials of being a journalist is trying to put yourself out of the picture and not get offended if people don't take you seriously, as long as you're getting the information you need, and try to remember that sometimes it's actually to your advantage if people don't take you seriously. I don't think I have a thick skin at all, and in fact I struggle with that a lot. I do, my pride does get wounded too often if I can tell that people are putting me down, and I try to remember that I don't need to do that. But that's a very, very hard thing. And I also, when I get deep criticism after writing a story, when I get nasty letters and insults and threats, I don't like it. There are journalists I know who like that, and who those letters are almost their scalps that they display proudly. And I don't have that, and I always have to steel myself for the reaction after a tough story. It's not a process that I enjoy. Don't ask me why I do it, I'm not sure.
Bethany McLean's reporting on Enron for Forbes magazine is widely acknowledged as being the first to question Enron's inflated stock price. After a series of revelations involving irregular accounting procedures bordering on fraud perpetrated throughout the 1990s involving Enron and its accounting firm Arthur Andersen, the company stood at the verge of undergoing the largest bankruptcy in history by mid-November 2001.
The Enron story was a very funny story because I did get some response from the Wall Street community with people saying, what a stupid story, these are dumb issues that she raises. But for the most part, the story really kind of came and went, and no one cared that much at the time because Enron stock was still $80 a share, and people didn't. It was only after the fact and after Enron's bankruptcy that people looked back on this story and said, oh look, someone did at least have some idea that there were problems coming.
Enron filed for bankruptcy at the end of November 2001, costing thousands of workers their jobs. Bethany McLean says Enron is far from unique.
I would say it's not isolated at all. I think people have always wanted to contain Enron by arguing it was just these bad people down in Houston, Texas, who did these bad things. But in fact, I think the entire system was complicit in what went wrong at Enron, and I think you see in the subprime crisis that's spreading around the globe today the seeds of the exact same things that brought down Enron. So I don't think it's contained at all. I don't think it's about the size of it so much as it is about the human flaws. I'm sure white-collar fraud happens here, and I think it's a lesson about how white-collar fraud happens, and it's rarely about people sitting in a dark room figuring out how to rip other people off. It's usually about almost a surplus of optimism and a belief that if you can just make it okay for the time being, that soon enough it will be okay. And you start down a slippery slope, and you move from A to B to C to D in such small increments that you don't even know you're moving until suddenly you're at Z, and you look back at A and you think, how did I get here? And I think that's why I think Enron is much more than a business story or a story about corporate greed. It's a morality tale, and it's a morality tale that can apply to any aspect of life, which is the slippery slope by which bad decisions are made.
McLean's story became an Oscar-nominated film. McLean herself became something of a celebrity. She's in New Zealand for a journalism education conference at Massey University in Wellington. There's no doubting her reporting and financial skills broke the scandal, but she says she was simply doing her job, and says Enron whistleblower Sharon Watkins is much more of a hero.
It gets into a definition of what courage is, right? And I'm not sure I was so much brave as I saw something and started down a path, and then I guess if I have one rule of journalism is that you have to say what you think, and you have to write the truth as you see it. And I think that's why I wrote the Enron story, but I'm not really sure that's courage per se. I mean, I think I had the luck of having an insight that proved to be right on, but some of that was lack of timing, and some of that was just plain luck. So I don't know. I think what Sharon Watkins did took a lot more courage, because she spoke up from inside a company and did something that wasn't necessarily expected of her. As a journalist, you're supposed to write things as you see them and bring controversy to light. As an employee of a company, you're not necessarily supposed to do that. Therefore, it takes, I think, more courage to step outside your role.
Enron went bankrupt. Thousands of people lost their jobs and pension savings. Top accounting firm Arthur Andersen collapsed. Enron's chairman and former CEO were convicted of charges of fraud, insider trading, money laundering and conspiracy. So in view of all that happened with Enron, does Bethany McLean believe deregulation of public utilities is the answer?
Oh, good heavens, that's a complicated question. That gets into a whole question about whether free markets work better than tightly regulated markets, and I don't pretend to have the answer to that.
So should Auckland Airport, for example, be sold to overseas investors?
I think there's a lot that these infrastructure funds have to prove about whether they will really be good community citizens and whether their financial models for buying infrastructure really work. But I also think there's a real question for governments and countries about what the alternative is, because countries from New Zealand to certainly the United States to India don't have the money to fund infrastructure needs on their own. So they really have no choice but to turn to the private sector. So it becomes a question of how do you employ the private sector in a way that it is forced to have community responsibilities, because I think when you look at history, the notion of a company serving two masters and having both a responsibility to its bottom line and a responsibility to the community, companies don't tend to do that very well unless they're forced to do that. So I think people have to be very smart about, communities have to be very smart about how they privatize their infrastructure and how they bring the private sector in. I mean, I have not heard, I wrote a big story about Macquarie Bank, the Australian company, in the fall, and I have not heard complaints about them necessarily being a bad community citizen, but you do hear complaints about the shakiness of the financial structures that they employ. And I think that's a very big question mark over the future.
Bethany McLean's story of the company, which took 16 years to build up $65 billion in assets and just 24 days to go bankrupt, is a riveting film directed by Alex Gibney. Does being the subject of a Hollywood movie change your life?
It's definitely had an impact because it's changed my perspective on a lot of things. I think it's made me I think I used to be a lot more black and white about people, and a lot more, I guess I just had the sense that if you were a bad person, you did bad things and you knew you were doing bad things, and otherwise you were a good person. And I think that's just much fuzzier and grayer than I might have once liked to think. And I think it's had an impact on me as a journalist because I'm aware that there may be this whole world that I don't know. In other words, I wrote this skeptical story about Enron, but I really barely even scratched the surface. I never would have imagined what lay beneath. I never would have imagined it, and nor could you have seen most of it from the outside. So I think I'm just aware of the multiple layers of truth, I guess, and how deep the entire picture can be.